morning, everyone. Great. I'm going to get a bit more psyched. Domain-driven design, and before I get started on any of my talks, I want to give a bit of a temperature reading for people inside the room. So developers, I need to just see hands of developers. How many developers we got here? Got a fair number of developers, BAE, analyst type people. There's a couple of those, and then the QA testing type of people. We've got one in the back, we've got another one over here. Good stuff. You won't be losing out. And then any infrastructure kind of people. I know we don't normally see them, but there's an infrastructure kind of person there as well. Good stuff. All right, domain-driven design. And I just wanted to say that it's a very, very complex topic. It takes a long time to get into, but I'd really like to just start sharing some of the ideas, and that's why I prefaced it. But, well, I didn't preface. I said it's an introduction to domain-driven design. Just to talk a little bit about some of the concepts, some of the interesting artifacts that we find have helped us in terms of software development, writing cleaner code, writing a cleaner solution. And so let's get on way. If we can have this working properly. So any talk that I do always starts with the beer talk. We have beers, craft beer available for people who can share, answer questions, give me some challenging input, share some ideas. And if you're not a beer person, then we have chocolates as well. So all right, cool. Let's move on. So who's this guy anyway, and what gives me the right to stand up and talk about domain-driven design? Well, I'm probably every time I go and look at domain-driven design and look at somebody else's talk, I feel like I'm learning something new. So I'm probably always learning about domain-driven design, always learning from the people that I interact with. And on the team I'm working on at that moment, I've been learning a huge amount of lots of interesting feedback. But I've been working with these concepts for the last, I would say, 8 years or so. In the beginning, I made lots of mistakes, and as we're getting into it now, we're starting to make less and less mistakes, and we're starting to get into it a little bit easier. And that's why I felt it would be a good opportunity to share some of these ideas with you. So what is domain-driven design? Well, domain-driven design, most people, when they look at it, seem to think that it started at the point where Eric Evans came up with this seminal piece called Domain-Driven Design, Tackling the Complexity in the Heart of Software. But if you start reading Evans's book, you see he starts drawing from a lot of other practical examples. So he references Martin Fowler, he references Kent Beck, he references a whole large number of people that added to the concept. So you would probably find that this idea of domain-driven design, or modeling your domain to try and get something that's understandable out of your software, started way before Evans put it down on a piece of paper. But this is where it actually started for me. It was picking up this book, reading the book, getting totally confused, and then starting to actually walk it through. Okay, so I see lots of people chuckling because it really is quite an interesting book, but it's also got a lot of complexity in it. So before I start talking too much about domain-driven design, I want to talk about the concept of a multifaceted team. And this is the idea that the team isn't just a group of developers, BAs, testers, siloed inside these little pigeonholes. The team is a multifunctional team. So developers get involved in the requirements gathering and get involved in understanding parts of this domain. They start understanding and aligning themselves with it. The BAs start aligning themselves closer to how we're going to test this system. So we have more BA testers, BAs, analysts, developers, and the developers also get involved in testing as well. All right, so it becomes a lot more of a cohesive group of people and not a siloed group of people that actually work. So if you're working on a team that's fully siloed, this is probably going to be something that is not going to be easy to adopt, because developers need to get their hands dirty. Developers need to start working with the domain concepts. For many years, I wrote farming software, and for many years, every Monday or Tuesday morning, a Farmer's Weekly would pop up onto my desk, and I would sit there paging it through, because I needed to understand the domain. I needed to become a domain expert, not in the true sense of the word, but in terms of the software development. And you need to start embracing these types of concepts, and embracing what you're doing, so that you can also talk from an expert's point of view on what you're trying to develop. All right, so it's a very, very strong concept that has to come through if you're going to start doing domain-driven development. Right. This is this is a slide to start talking about a very, very strong concept that Evans brings in his book. It's the very first concept he starts talking about. Then this is probably one of the most flawed projects. Goes way, 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 way back. Has anybody got an idea what project this actually is? It's the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel was a flawed project. Does anybody know why it was a flawed project? Communication. That's right. So people tried to build this exceptionally high tower. Everybody spoke the same language. And halfway through the project, everybody started speaking a different language. And nobody could finish the project. Everybody scattered to the four corners of the earth, and that was it. The Tower of Babel was no longer a project. So think about that as a project. Think about that concept for a moment, just for a little moment. How many times have you walked into a project and the BA is talking using these terms, and the developer starts using these terms, and you're all talking about the same thing, but you're not? Very, 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 very common concept. I remember going into a meeting where somebody was talking about a loan, and somebody else was talking about a contract. And they were both arguing with each other, but they were both talking about the same thing. All right. So the very, 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 very first thing that Evan starts bringing out in his book on domain-driven design is the concept of a ubiquitous language. It's the concept of a language that goes across the entire project. Everybody talks the same thing. So on a project where somebody comes in and says, oh, it's this, and a new person comes in and says, I understand it to be this, there needs to be consensus on what that term is, on what that phrase is, on what those concepts are. Because as soon as you start polluting your language with large numbers of conflicting concepts or concepts that could actually cause confusion, you're going to get the confusion inside your project, and the code's going to become a real problem. All right. So the idea is to have a common language. And that idea of common language spreads throughout the entire project. It starts from the requirements, from the specifications. It goes all the way through to the domain. It even goes right down to the database. And if you go onto Instruct, you'll have a look at and find the last talk that I did on Agile database development, where we take it to the extreme, where we were actually going, if that concept inside the database was called something and it now needs to be called something else, there is a strategy we need to put in place to be able to keep that language fresh and all the way through the entire domain, from the specifications all the way through the model, all the way through into the database, all the way back out to the testing, because we do not want confusion to come along and derail our projects. Projects are mostly derailed, or often derailed, because of the fact that the language is so complicated and people are just constantly talking cross purposes. So a very strong concept that Evans brings through is the concept of a ubiquitous language. He also brings through this concept of bringing in domain experts into the problem that you're trying to solve. Now, this is a very, very hard problem to solve. And one of the guys at the SQS talk last week put up his hand and said to me, what was the most difficult part of implementing domain-driven design? Well, domain-driven design as a concept is actually quite difficult. To tease out the concepts is exceptionally difficult. But even more difficult than teasing out concepts and getting ideas into software is trying to pin down an expert. Experts don't want to spend time with you. It's very difficult to try and get them to, work on you, except in a few weird cases where it was easy to find a farmer who could talk my ear off for days about what he did because he was so passionate about what he did and he believed that he needed to share it. But in most cases, I found it actually is quite difficult. I'm not saying abandon the idea, but you need the expert to start coming and bringing you alongside so that when you play back, this is how we're solving the problem, the expert can listen to you and go, I understand, or I don't understand. And if he doesn't understand, then there's a problem. Your model's probably a problem. The software solution is probably going to be a bit of a problem. All right, so that was one of the big concepts that he brought through. And then from that point, we're able to start deriving what we call the model. We're going to talk a lot more about the model, but the model is really just a way of describing the problem we're trying to actually solve, or describing the solution to the problem we're going to try and solve. And I'm not going to dwell on it hugely now because it is I just want to plant the seed. We're going to start looking at actual models as we start walking through this presentation. Before I veer off onto models and designs, I want to talk a little bit about documentation because this is a bit of a passion for me. And when I read Evans's book, I started to get quite excited because this is what I normally hear when I'm working on a project. Working software over comprehensive documentation. It's rule number 2 or 3 out of the Agile Manifesto. The general premise on working on an Agile project is that the code should be the documentation. And that's cool if we're all coders. It's not cool if we're domain experts. Anybody ever tried to get a domain expert to learn a programming language? Eugene?
Maybe.
But Ruby is just so simple. I don't want to know. If I see an if statement, I don't want to know. So the concept of documentation is super important. The idea of putting down everybody's ideas and sharing ideas is important. It is an important aspect of a software development project. And if you read that sentence again, working software over comprehensive documentation, it doesn't say working software over no documentation. It says working software over comprehensive documentation. We're not looking for the tome that arrives on your desk and shatters the whole desk as you put it down. We're looking for lightweight ways of communicating with each other. And these are acceptable lightweight ways on a project that I'm working on. That's a screen grab of the farming application that we were working. It's a whiteboard diagram. Everybody knew what we were doing. That went into the wiki. That was the domain model for, I don't know, 2 years before we even decided to actually put it into a hard copied version where somebody sat down in Visio or Glyphy or whatever it was to actually start documenting. Simple screen designs using Balsamic or some other really easy SketchUp program that you can actually get things going down. Put it into a wiki so that everybody's got an access to the glossary of terms or the language that you're actually using inside your system. It doesn't have to be a very complex way of documenting the system. It can be simple, it can be easy. The only time it becomes a lot more complex is when it actually has to go to clients or there are a large number of people that are doing presentations on it. Then it becomes a little bit more tricky. But for the purposes of doing a software project, that for me is acceptable. It's acceptable to do a video and have it put it up into your wiki and people to be able to watch it over when they need to be able to do it. It's acceptable to pre-record or record discussions with people and upload those files so people go back and listen to the meetings. Those are acceptable ways of trying to get the domain out of the system. We need to think more laterally about how we document our processes. Right, as you can hear, it's a bit of a passion for me when I start a new project and I don't find any documentation and I'm going to wade through millions of lines of code to even try and find it, and then the developer goes, working software over comprehensive documentation. I want to punch him. All right. So before I started working on this concept of domain-driven design, I worked on a number of projects. I was a consultant. I walked around, worked here, worked there, basically peddled myself to be able to just do as many projects as I could and learn as much as I could. I like to get badges. I did this type of project, did that project, and it was fun. And then eventually I started to grow up and settle down a little. But I want to talk a little bit about concepts. And if you have a look at this little Viking boat that's running around in the sea there, that's a very, very, very light business concept. Business concepts, business ideas are light and fluffy. They're very, 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 very easy to break. And if you have a look here, you can't really see it here, but those eyes over there, that's the Kraken. Okay, that's the software development team about to crash your project with some really poor code. And I want to just show you some of the code that I was working with. I actually went and pulled this out of one of the projects that I was working with. And I'll just to illustrate some of the points as we're starting. So this is a site where we were doing, I actually inherited this thing. It was for property developers to go and put their development on there, and they could put all kinds of interesting things in. And I just want to walk through this code. This is a code from the last step of a wizard. You've gone through, it's asked you a whole heap of questions, and it's now going to start doing some stuff. So start connecting to databases, starts creating this thing called new sites. It's going to get some parameters inside for a stored procedure. It's going to start walking through. It's going to start putting in the new site navigation inside. It's going to carry on working here. So I've got new site navigation in here. I'm going to put all the users for the new site. Now I'm going to create users inside the new site. And all of a sudden I've got some business rules, and the business rules have crept into the UI, and we're starting to walk through. You can just see it. It's just like, it's ugly, it's nasty. There's more rules around what the landing page should look like. There's a couple more business rules around what we do with images, and there's another business rule, and we're just walking through business rules and code and some more code and business rules, and look at it. It's wonderful. It's absolutely stunning. And there was a part that I really wanted to dwell on a little bit. The telltale sign of a really bad function is when somebody has to put regions inside a function because you can't, it's so long you can't actually see it. Okay. That's the type of code that we used to work with. I mean, I'm going back like 10, 12 years now, but I mean, that's the type of code. That's ugly. How does anybody debug that? How does any tester come up with test cases that they can test that type of concept? How does any business person quantify what on earth they're trying to achieve inside the system? Not easy. And that's what we were working with. And so when we, sorry. When we came into domain-driven design, this became a fresh way of thinking, a very interesting way of thinking. And so what did we get out of it? One of the first parts that we started looking at was this concept of layered architecture. So Evans in his book talks about layered architecture, and he talks about starting to put together some form of layered architecture. But why would we want layered architecture? As you saw in the previous example, we had supporting code, database connectivity, sending out emails. That was all littered inside business code where we had to try and get concept. You saw those if statements. If it's number 4, do this. If it's this, do that. If it's this, do. That's business logic. Those are things that are required from a business standpoint. That is a difficult piece of code to maintain. If we start thinking about decoupling the solution, if we start thinking about ring fencing certain concepts and moving them out and spreading the thing out a little bit so that we've got testable units of code, they're easy to understand because there's not 5,000 concepts that you have to hold in your head when you're starting to work through the function. And they're easy to maintain because it's really just a concise piece of work. Somebody can easily look at it, easily understand it, and easily get to what they're trying to achieve. If we start isolating some of the logic, so we start putting the logic into smaller containers, again, it's easier to understand and it's easier to maintain. So what does this layered architecture look like? Quite simple. I'm going to start from the bottom. We take all the infrastructure. How do we connect to a database? How do we authenticate a user? How do we, send an email? How do we send SMSs? We take that infrastructure, which is non-business related, and we move it into an infrastructure layer. And we'll talk a little bit later as we start to walk through this development. You'll start to see where that goes. But we start to ring fence it. If you ring fence it, the testers can start testing it as an isolated element. The developers don't have to worry about what it takes to send an email. It just goes off to a service or gets put to some endpoint somewhere. They don't really have to figure it out too much. And it starts uncluttering the problem domain a huge amount, because business people don't want to know that you're sending a mail or how you're sending a mail. They just want to know that the mail goes. And it goes because this thing in the model has actually changed. I'm going to skip over this a little bit. We won't skip over too much. I'll come back to it. The concept of the domain is actually the thing we're trying to solve. We're trying to model the problem at hand. All right, so we'll move over that a little bit and move into application. In application, you're really concerned about how the flow of the application is working, what I'm calling where, what the workflow is going to be, what the process flows are actually going to be, and that's going to be able to live in here. Again, it's decoupled from the problem we're trying to solve. And then up to interface, and if you read Evans' book, he has user interface, and for me, I've just actually taken the concept of user interface out, because interfaces for me are not more than just user interfaces. They could be APIs, so they could be some sort of web interface, not web interface, web service interface. There could be some sort of REST-based API. So everything moves up into the interface, how I'm going to present it, what it's going to look like. Coming back to the domain is the point where we're trying to solve the actual problem. What does this thing look like inside the business? What does an invoice look like? What does an invoice line item look like? What does the accrual of interest look like? How do we do that? What does the shipping log look like? What does the itinerary for an air trip look like? That is the domain. If I was in the air industry and I was trying to work out some sort of travel process for somebody, the concept I'm trying to solve is the itinerary for the person who's flying around the world. I'm not worried about communicating with them or how we're going to coordinate, the front end or parts of the application. Is that making sense? All right. So that's the first part, is starting to strip everything out and put it away in the cupboard. When you were a kid and your mom came in, you got to put everything away and clean it up, and the place is a mess, and then you knew where to be able to go and find things. If this was in that cupboard, this was in that cupboard, put it over there, put that in the toy box, all sorted out. So that's the first aspect of starting to rein in the craziness inside the code. The previous concept was trying to rein in the craziness in terms of the project itself. So I'm going to try a little bit of a domain example just to give you some ideas of where we are. Now I can't go too deep because we'll get a little bit confused, and I don't have the time to spend a massive amount of time to spend on this, but let's have a look at this. This is an online system. We had the concept of a potential customer come into the system. They could register with this particular service, and while registering they would complete some kind of questionnaire that would give us an idea of what they were trying to achieve with the software that we were providing. At some point, a back office person could decide whether that potential customer was going to become a full-blown customer, and would take that registration and create an account from that. And on that account we could create some account users, and we had some kind of process where we could price the solution we were trying to solve. And we could see that we have a customer at this point of year who now gets an account, and we have a customer employee who's going to be doing the work on behalf of the customer. All right, so the last part of the system, which is just off on that side over there, which is the whole point about verifying data that we're looking at, we could create this verification application for a person of interest. We didn't know who they were or what they were, but there was some person that we were interested in that we needed to check some information on, and we could go back and do a series of verifications on them. Who here doesn't understand the problem I'm trying to solve? No one. It's actually quite simple. It's a very simple, high-level domain diagram of the problem we were trying to solve. Now, granted, this system is hugely complex. There are probably 30 or 40 different verifications that are happening inside the back. There's way complicated pricing models inside this whole thing. The whole account structure is hierarchical. If this and it's got a whole craziness around it. But everybody around the table now understands the problem I'm trying to solve, because we've brought it out using a simple domain diagram. Business people around a boardroom table can understand it. And if I exploded this out a little bit more, they would still understand it, and explode it out a little bit more, they would still be able to understand it. They're understanding where the value is, where they're trying to what problems we're trying to solve. We're not cross-communicating with each other. So the concept of the domain diagram is starting to materialize. We're going to walk through this domain and start to see how we started to split things out, how we started to bring things out using these concepts of domain-driven design. All right. In order to make a model work really nicely, we've got to do a couple of things. Models aren't things that you just look at and they spring out at you. When you're working with very, very complex domains, when you're working in the banking sector, in the insurance sector, you're working in the shipping sector, when you're working in the airline freight industry sector, these concepts sometimes have been solved by people, but some people are often doing unique problems, trying to solve problems in a unique way, and you're trying to model that domain in a very, very clever way. The model doesn't spring out at you at the first time. You look at it and you go, that's how it's solved, because that's how I solved it before, or that's how I've read somebody else solved it. You generally put some sort of model down, and that's not a bad thing. It's the start of the modeling process. We would code some sort of model, and we would write the tests that support the coding of that model, and this is an important aspect of it. In order to do successful domain-driven design, you have to have test-driven development as a cornerstone to what you're doing. Some form of test-driven development, some way of running an automated test and going, okay, the model's changing now like this. Do all the other business rules still hold? Do all the other things hold valid? testing is a very important aspect of it. And as you go through each cycle of your iterative process, every single sprint a new piece of software is brought out, you need to model, code, test, model, code, test, this whole recycle, rinse and repeat process of trying to solidify your model and work out how the process is actually, how we were actually trying to solve the problem. So the whole concept of testing is exceptionally important for evolving the model. I've gone off on a tangent because I do think it's important. A lot of people don't do test-driven development, and we didn't do, for many years, didn't do very good test-driven development because we battled with the concepts. And what it meant for us is that these parts here, these models, were never really rich. We were never confident enough to be able to go, okay, I'm making a change to the model. Is it going to affect the entire system? I think the last 2 or 3 projects that we've worked on now, where we've done TDD and now using BDD, right from the ground up, we've got the confidence to go change, break, figure it out. And that's for everything. Performance checking, trying to make things work more optimally, trying to make the model work optimally. The whole concept of test-driven development is hugely important here. I'm not saying you can't do domain-driven design without it. I'm just saying that it's very difficult to tease the model out without having these tests. So testing is important, and why is it important? Well, if you have DDD at the cornerstone, of the top of what we're actually trying to achieve, and we have test-driven development over here, you can see if we can't do experimentation and iterative design, we cannot start to model, start to get our model working correctly. If we start to adopt behavior-driven development, where the business starts helping us define what the behavior of the system starts working, how the system starts working, is we now start to have a collaboration across a business focus. And if we now bring these two together, we've got a large number of automated tests that can start testing that our model is actually working. All right, so that's how this little triad starts fitting together. And it's, I mean, you could do it successfully doing it with one part of it, but we've found that as you start getting into it, into more and more complex domains, into very, very complex ways of doing it, this triad actually needs to work together. All right, so we're going back to our problem. And one of the things that Evans brings out in his book is this whole concept of a bounded context. If you look at this problem, if you'd followed the year and a bit that we worked on this particular problem, certain concepts start to show themselves to you. Very quickly, actually not very quickly, actually yes, very quickly the whole concept of a registration, the idea of registrations being a standalone concept solidified quite quickly. So we had a registration, and it had some sort of questionnaire associated with it. Whether a registration was taken to an account or not was immaterial. It could stand alone. And registration could move from being a registration to becoming an account, but it didn't necessarily have to. So the idea that registration stand alone was very strong. And the whole concept of a bounded context here is that we have some form of registration process. If we move into account management, you can see it here in green. We started to see that there were some concepts around managing accounts, managing account users, and managing the price for the service that we were giving. They started to come out nicely, and we started to now be able to ring fence the concept of the account model or the account domain. And as we started to move on to the verification, we had the verification application with verifications, person of interest, and that was being pushed into a verification engine. We now started to see a whole bounded context in terms of the verification system. So if you look at that system today, you will find there's probably 1 or 2 additional contexts which I haven't brought to the table because they were just cut to the design. But we have very clearly a registration, an account management, and a verification process. Clear and simple. They're separated from each other. There is some touch over from one to the other a little bit, and there's some techniques to try and not get those to leak too much, but you will start to see the concept of bounded context inside your solutions. All right. What wasn't very obvious when we started was this concept of potential customer, and customer employee. And they're there in purple, and I've drawn them on a line. because as we started to model the system, we had a customer inside the system. We had this concept of a potential customer. But we realized very quickly that that customer didn't have to be an entity inside our system. It could actually just be some very lightweight information about it. And over time, these concepts, which what we thought were part of our domain model, actually evaporated. The customer just became an account, with some very clever ways of managing an account and some hierarchical ways of managing the account. I could toss the concept of a customer out completely. And it is interesting because the language that the business people were talking to us was not about customers, it was about accounts. We have these accounts. I go and work on this account. And that language became very quickly drove how we were actually solving the problem. So customer went away, customer employee went away completely, and he became an account user. So the idea I'm trying to get to here, because I don't have a huge amount of time to explain just how the whole concept of domain-driven design comes in, but over time, certain ideas which you think are pivotal ideas start to distill and move away from you, and you don't actually need to have them inside the system. So gone, and we now have very, very strong bounded context. In order to do bounded context and separation of concerns, you have to have tests. And to coordinate that the business is not going to break, you need to now also start bringing in continuous integration. You can do it without continuous integration, but how many of us run to work? How many of us ride to work? How many of us walk to work? We can do it. It's just difficult. Okay, so you could do it without it, but you're probably not going to be successful. And the whole idea of bringing in a continuous integration server, which checks the code out at an interval, or when somebody checks the code in, runs the unit tests, makes sure that the system is still up and running, is super, super important. All right. All right. A very strong concept that came through in Evans's book as well is this concept of aggregates. In a large number of projects that you've probably worked on, you've often, especially when we start modeling things in an object side, and those objects need to be persisted to a database, you often have, and I would say predominantly have, these entities as separate entities. So this entity goes into this table, this entity goes into this table, this entity goes into this table. And when you start working with the code, you're working with a large number of separate entities. Evans takes that out and says, how about you try and get those entities to work as a cohesive unit? So as we look inside our application, I have a verification application, and I have it done on behalf of a person of interest. Those two concepts together tie up quite nicely. Person of interest cannot be his own entity by himself. He can't live inside the system, inside that problem domain by himself. But he can only attach himself to a verification application. And the list of verifications that I'm going to do on that particular person of interest cannot live by themselves. They have to live on a verification application. They work as a cohesive unit. And the idea is to model those on paper, as we've done here, and in code as a one cohesive unit. Because now we actually have what we call this little unit of work. We can take that unit, we can verify it very quickly by saying, put on the business rule that says we have to have at least one verification, or if we have this verification, we need to have this verification, or if we have this verification, we can't have this verification. Very quickly, those business rules can be contained in another piece of code that can look at it, but that piece of code would be working on this aggregate, this cohesive unit. All right. I hope that's making sense, because it's a very strong concept, and this is the one thing that as we started to bring aggregates into our designs, we started to understand the problem a little bit easier, we started to break things out a little bit easier, and we started to write code that was much easier to maintain and much easier to manage. Along with aggregates comes this concept of a repository. We need to get the data in and out of our system. And so there's this concept of a data store or repository, or getting stuff into the data store using this pattern called the repository. Now, I'm going to quickly try and describe a little bit of what the repository looks like and how it can work. And maybe if there's a little bit more of confusion, you guys can start talking to me or asking some questions as we go through. All right. Let's have a look at this aggregate here. I've got this user aggregate, and on my user aggregate I'm going to keep the roles that I've got inside the system and potentially the groups that I belong to, because in this particular domain, in this particular model, that's how I saw a user existing inside my system. User, roles, groups, and that would be one single aggregate. Got a number of rules on here. User can only have 2 roles. User can only belong to a certain number of groups. You know, if you belong to this role, you can't belong to these groups. You can start modeling things quite nicely. I'm not going to get into it too deeply, but you can start to understand the flexibility that it starts giving me when I start modeling things as aggregates. So here's the aggregate for my user, for my user inside my domain, and I can start bringing in a repository. And the repository is a common way of getting in and out of whatever persistence mechanism I'm choosing. If you have a look at this, I've got an option for 2 persistence mechanisms. I've gone to AD because I need to be able to do some form of verification, and maybe I need to get some sort of organizational roles outside the system, and I could also go into a database. Potentially that's where the groups belong for my system. And the whole idea behind a repository is that you never define. The repository abstracts away the idea of data persistence. So if I wanted to save this information to a text file, an XML file, if I wanted to save it to some web service out on the web, this part of the system up should not know a single thing about what I'm using to persist. The repository abstracts away the concept of connecting to some sort of data store. It doesn't. You don't need to know where to get the information from. You don't need how to know to get the information composed. It's a very strong part of the repository. Another aspect of a repository is that it always serves up an aggregate in a form that I could either use to save away, or in a form that is well constructed and it's got all the information that the aggregate needs to be able to communicate to me. So for example, when I use a create user, I've got a little factory method on here, and this is a very strong concept that Evans brings through, the use of factories, specific factories to be able to put together certain ideas. And we've all seen this factory pattern in a large number of software projects that we use. We even use a factory as a class, or we use a little factory as a method. But this factory would always give me a user that was well defined and that I could use straight away. It had predefined values. It had default values set so that if I just created the user and added the user, it would go straight into the database. Right. That means that juniors and people further up the chain don't have to vex themselves with, do I need to check for this, or is this thing actually going to work like this? It's actually in a state which I can actually use without having to fuss about null checks and all kinds of other craziness that I see often coming up into UIs and things like that. Along with that, we've got an ability to add a user, we've got ability to delete a user, ability to save some sort of user if we were doing some sort of update. And then we start bringing in the idea to be able to find a user. And this is where certain concepts start to come in. And we start bringing up some of the ideas. So I'm going to come back to that. So we talked a little bit about undefined persistence. We talked about loading with a factory. We're going to come back to that. But the one thing that I really wanted to talk about is this concept of intention revealing interfaces. If one of the developers or anybody looking at that particular piece of code, there's not one person in this room that cannot tell me they do not understand what that piece of code is actually doing. I'm not asking you to understand how you connect to AD or how you connect to the data persistence. At this point here, you know that you can create some sort of user. You know that you can save or delete a user. You can find a user by ID, or you can find a user by username. It's simple, it's trivial, it's very, very easy to understand. And that's a concept that Evans brings through in his book, which is the intention revealing interfaces. And we see this when we start working with other concepts, whereas this DAMP concept, which is deep and meaningful phrases, when you start working with other ideas. And it's very strong and easy to start understanding. The concept of a specification, Evan started to bring in as well. If we have a look at this function, find user by username, that is a specification. That's a intent. It's a function with an intent to find a particular user by username. And The other area where specifications start to become very powerful is on validation. I can create a validation class that holds all the rules around validation, and we often did this. In the save user or the add user function, we would have a validator which would take an aggregate and run through all the rules to make sure that this thing was actually working. It could have worked, you could save without going to validation, but if you wanted to put the validation mantle on, you're able to now encapsulate all those rules. They're not potentially not part of the user object. They could be, they could not be. It doesn't. Yep, that's one of. You could change it that way, or you could now start moving it out into these things called specifications. What it started to bring for us is a series of standards, and a series of a term which I've now adopted thanks to the team I'm working with at the moment, which is called coding by convention. And in fact, the team I'm working with at the moment goes to the extreme, which I love, which is testing by convention. So just to explain what that means is that there's a particular way in which code is now written. Every repository will have a create, add, delete, and save for that particular entity. It might have a find by ID, the primary key, and then from that point onwards it would have certain specifications around what the intent of that particular repository is. But if you have a look at that and you have a look at another repository, you will very clearly understand what the intent of that piece of code actually is. And when code starts to break, I can't add a user. Where should I go? I'm probably going to go to add user because that's essentially where the rules are. If the user's code is not being verified properly, I'll probably go to the verification specification, the validation specification, to be able to understand where that piece of code actually, but it's compartmentalized, it's separated, and it's easy to understand, it's easy to get into. What it also means is that I can start setting some rules on there. And just an interesting story, in the first day that I worked on the team I'm working with now, I understood a concept of a manager to be this particular concept. And so I coded my manager like that. And very quickly got a little knock on my shoulder to say, you've broken the build. It's like, how did I break the build? All my tests are passing, everything is passing. And somebody piped up in the corner and said, your convention test is not passing. And it meant that me as a person coming into the system, coming in to do development, was actually breaking it not because I had any malintention, but it was breaking it because there were rules which I didn't understand at that time, which would be broken. And the idea of bringing in standards and these conventions and testing for these conventions is now more powerful, because if you have these standards, you can test for them. All right. So that's the repository, getting information in and out of the system, and I've brought and dumped a large number of Evans's concepts in there because they don't necessarily only fit with repositories. The whole concept of a factory doesn't only sit with a repository, but it just became very easy for me to show you how we'd implemented the idea of specifications, having single pieces of code that actually do validations or do specific checks or do certain business processes. That is also a concept that we brought into our repositories, but they don't necessarily have to live there. The intention revealing interfaces is that services, repositories, concrete classes should all have intention revealing interfaces. It makes the code so much easier to understand. And then coding by convention or some form of standards will bring me to the very last point of what I'm doing. So let's just hold that point a little bit. Inside the system, we always have a large number of services that we're trying to do. They often clutter up what the intent of the software actually is. And another very strong concept which Evans brings through in the book is the idea of separating things out into these different services to be able to do specific things. So if you have a look here, we had our concern of registration. We can bound it now with the registration service, and we could now deploy or put some documentation on how you use that particular registration service. And we have the concept of a service which people outside can actually use. Our domain, we've got an account, and we've got validation, verification. And if you have a look here, we have the infrastructural services which we don't actually need to bring in and clutter our domain. We need to be able to send notifications out to people. We need to be able to authenticate somebody when they come in to use our service. We need to be able to store documentation inside that system. Did any of you know that we needed to do that by looking at the initial domain? No. Did you care No, it was ancillary pieces of information about solving a particular problem that we were actually doing. So we did need to send emails when things were verified and the people were happy. We did need to authenticate somebody coming in, and anybody doing some sort of verification always had to attach certain documentation, certain legal documentation that was required to be able to do it. It wasn't something that would dictate our domain. It was just a requirement, a very simple requirement that needed to happen. And so it becomes easy to now separate out all these concepts and have them as standalone entities or concepts to be able to work on. This makes it easy for business people to go, just send an email. It should be that simple. And often it isn't, because the code is cluttered inside, the domain code is cluttered inside, the connection to the database code. Should be able to just be able to attach a document. It's ancillary to what we're actually trying to do. This makes testing inside our system exceptionally easy, because we're now just testing certain aspects, and we've got these points, inflection points, in which we can actually look into the domain and actually start testing and start understanding what we're trying to achieve. Evans talks quite a lot about domain, and as we were starting to work through this, this idea of a core domain started to come out to us. And I just want to talk about it quite quickly because I found it quite interesting. In hindsight, having looked at the system, we could have actually done something quite interesting. A couple of months after we had finished this particular project, somebody came into us and said, we'd like you to work on another project, which is very similar. It was actually within the same business. It did the same kind of concept. It did verification of content or verification of data on behalf of some person of interest. And it started to also have very similar account structures, and it was a very similar way in which the accounts were managed. But they were two separate systems. The company saw them as two very, very, very separate systems. This thing did this, and these salespeople ran around over here, and this thing did this, and these salespeople ran over here. They were in very different parts of the industry. But if you took the domains and brought them closer to each other, the whole concept of managing accounts became quite a lot simpler. They were quite common, and there was a lot of overlap in what they were doing. And so what we found is that there was this idea of a core domain that started to come out to the front. This idea of managing accounts and being able to manage pricing and be able to start becoming very clever and innovative around how accounts were managed or how pricing was done, because we were bringing in concepts from the other service. And so this idea starts to pop up, and it only starts to pop up when you start to get other systems bringing in and starting to add to the domain model. Which brings me to a very interesting concept. I had quite a discussion on Friday afternoon with somebody talking about domain-driven design, and a lot of the very hardcore domain-driven design people saying, if you are doing domain-driven design, you need to do it across the whole organization. And I never really believed it too much, but when I started to look at this design and I started to understand that if the whole organization had started to club together in terms of domain-driven design, we would start to now separate out this concept of accounts, start to create out an account service. I bet there would probably be a lot of overlap in that verification side as well. We could start getting core domains, and we could start consolidating the concepts inside our organization, consolidating the code and making the code base simpler and simpler to understand and easier to use, easier to maintain, and the longevity of that software would be much longer, and the actual return on investment would probably be huge, because we weren't spending so much time trying to figure out two different ways of managing accounts and how we were going to do these accounts. Right, so that is a very, very, very core concept that comes through when you start talking to the more stronger domain-driven development people. Will bring me to my last slide, and what we learnt and where we were going. And it's a very, I know it's a strange picture, because probably 80% of this room are not the most sporty people on the planet. We like to watch, but we don't like to take part. There's a very interesting book which I'd encourage you to read called Adrenaline Junkies and Template Zombies, and it's not a development book, so anybody can pick it up and read it. And it really talks about organizational it's more of an organizational kind of book about patterns that happen inside organizations. So the adrenaline junkies are the people who like new tech. They like it to, you know, I want a new stuff. I want to be able to test the stuff. But they never really make sure that the thing actually sees the end of the day. It's just kind of like it's new tech, new tech, new tech, new tech, new tech. So just to give you an idea of what kind of book it is. There's a pattern in there called the bench, and this pattern just stuck with me. And as I started to walk through our experiences on domain-driven design, this idea of the bench started to come through very strong. So the idea of the bench is to always have players available to help you out when another player is sick, he injures himself, or I don't know, he's just not having a good day today. You know, we have those. We have developers who just have a really bad day, and it would be really great if somebody could step in and be able to help them. And this concept of the bench is exceptionally powerful. But how do you create a bench? Creating a bench is difficult, because how do you go to your boss and say, I'm going to get a guy, he's going to walk around, kind of do some stuff, he'll do some work, but he's really not going to be a key guy. He's going to be the guy who just sits around waiting. You imagine telling your boss this. He's going to be a guy who sits around waiting for the problems to actually happen. It's not a very easy concept to sell. But you can solve it in different ways. And the way we started to see how we could solve it, was be able to build this bench, was to be able to build a way in which we spoke to each other. The ubiquitous language started to become a very strong communication around the system. The coding to a particular interface, the standards that we brought into the system. What it meant was, bringing in these ideas of domain-driven design, is that people who understood the language, people could pick up the domain quite quickly because it was fairly easily documented, fairly easy to understand. People who started to understand the interfaces and where they actually lived could actually pick up the code quite quickly. So if somebody went on leave, it wasn't a problem. Oh, Joe's going on leave, he's working on the user module right now. Joe, can you tell Sam where you are? Sam, you pick up and carry on going. It's very, very simple. And when a piece of code broke, users aren't able to add a particular feature onto their basket of things that they're trying to do. Well, there's the basket manager, and these are the features, therefore it should be over there. Joe, can you jump into the code and please go and have a look? Because it was that easy to understand. And so the building of the bench was not actually adding more people to the system, it was adding more understanding to the system. And so people could start to pick up from each other as they went on. All right, and that's me for the day on domain-driven design. It's very, very short-circuited. The book is a tome, and we're going to give out a book today. So I'm going to ask Philippa to run around and just get your name tags here so we can do a draw. But this is the book. It's particularly heavy. It's not, and as you start working through it, you'll find that it's not an easy read, an easy concept. But you stick with it, you start to understand just how powerful the ideas are. The other thing that I find is, as I talk to more and more people who work in the domain-driven design world, is that I always feel like I've lost something. I may have missed something. And the more we talk about these ideas, the more we share them, the easier it is to start understanding where we made our mistakes and how we work. Right, so final thing for me is that Instruct is on YouTube, as Rory said. All the videos are released probably 3 to 4 weeks after one of these events. There are a large number of them, so I often refer back to some of them, so they're there for that particular reason. And then the next talk, can I talk about it? All right, I'm going to put my foot out there, and let's see if we go. So I think the next talk, February next year. January, February, we're thinking probably around then. I didn't have a topic, but I'm trying to strong arm my partners into talking about Xamarin. We've had successful projects with Xamarin, which is a mobile development platform for C#, and I think it would be great to have the discussion, talk about it, have a look at it. So I think early next year, Xamarin would probably be the talk that we would look to get. We don't have a date just yet, but we'll get back to you. All right, with that, should we go into Q&A? All right, I was expecting something. Eugene, who's going to go first?
Okay, with modern design, the way that size of software companies operating in year 2000 upwards, they focus on the developers who come for an interview, you get a job, and it's like, have you got this? Have you got MVC? Have you got this design pattern? Do you know this? Do you know that? Not one question I've been asked in the 2000s, what's your understanding of business? Do you understand about accounts? Do you understand about general ledgers? There's no requirement with a modern programmer to have domain knowledge.
That's right.
Now, if we go back to the 1990s and 80s where I developed and grew up, it was key. Do you understand about accounts? Do you understand about ledgers?
Yes.
Now, when you're talking about your bench, what you could have is one person who is a developer who can talk to the domain expert, speak his language, understand the system, and develop on any part of the system.
Right.
He will actually act as a coordinator to actually get a better system, and should anyone go on leave, he can fill in on any role.
The only problem is if he goes on leave. Sorry, I don't want to cut, but I mean, but I agree with you. I agree totally with you, and it does frustrate me when I sit down with junior developers and I'm going like, you need to understand just the basic concept of some form of accounting system, because let me tell you, the number of accounting systems that I've worked on, truckloads. Even in the banking system, I had to work with basic concepts of accounting, and so you're right, and I think it's something that is required to be there. And I think what we seem to have done, which sometimes irritates me, and I don't get too offended when I say this, we've siloed everything off. We've said these are the BAs and they will do the general ledger type concepts and understanding, and these are the developers and they will get their instructions from the BAs and they will do their kind of thing, and these are the developers and they will give their stuff onto the testers. And I believe the testers need to know that stuff as well. And so that's why I like the idea of a multifaceted team. That's why I like the idea of a BA knowing how to do testing and a tester knowing how to do some requirements gathering, and it's being part of that system, and developers as well. I don't think there's a single developer in our company, that's not an analyst developer, that can't actually go out there and start asking those types of questions, because I think it's super important. It has to be there. Yeah, valid point. Beer? Chocolate?
Yeah, thanks.
Good choice.
You mentioned with regards to the domain-driven design, then I see it as a philosophy or methodology. But behind that kind of methodology, you've got a set of very concrete implementations in place. We talked about test-driven development, behavioral development, continuous integration. In a team or an organization where those aren't very good priority, where would I begin to try and get the most amount of buy-in in order to start building on top of this methodology?
It's not a nice question. So I want to just, you've mentioned something which I find fascinating and which has always been comforting for me, is that you use the word philosophy. And you're right, it's a philosophy. Agile is a philosophy. Anything that we do is a philosophy. There are different ways of implementing it. Sure, you can do it Scrum and you can do it Kanban, but ultimately you're trying to achieve a particular goal. So you're right, domain-driven design is a philosophy, and associated with it are a large number of these, what do we call them, artifacts that we can use to get in there. We did domain-driven design to a degree. I'm not saying we did it perfectly. We did have continuous integration in there, but without test-driven development, without behavioral-driven development techniques in there, we managed to get large numbers of code to be able to be understandable. We managed to get a project that actually worked, a product that worked really well, without having to go all the way to that extreme side of the programming side. In hindsight, I wouldn't have done it, because I see the value now, once having done projects where TDD and BDD are very focused. I wouldn't do it, but it can be done. So you could start, and where we started was, we started with the Ubiquitous Language. We started with getting involved with domain experts. We started subscribing to industry journals. We started by adopting some of the simpler artifacts like the repository, like the aggregates. We started moving things out to services. So there are ways in which you can start working it. I think the only problem is that it gets to a point where the value in the real value in domain-driven development is the model. and is trying to tease out the concepts inside the model. And without test-driven development, the model becomes very difficult to tease out because you need that constant feedback of, have I broken something, especially when you're working inside an enterprise type solution. What I need to also underscore here is that I don't use this technique, although sometimes I kind of mix it in a little bit. I don't use this technique if I'm developing a very simple application. I mean, when we're talking here, we're talking large, complex systems that require very knowledgeable people to be able to help me through the domain, because it's the main things that I do not understand, and they walk through it quite quickly. So I would start, as we went through the presentation, start with Ubiquitous Language, start interacting with the experts, start some sort of layered architecture, start with the bounded context, aggregates, repositories, out into services, and you'll start to see your code clean out a lot clearer. Yeah? Anybody else got a question?
Just a quick one. You spoke about ubiquitous language.
Yes.
And before Venn diagram.
Yeah.
Is there a standard for that Venn diagram?
It's a good question. And guys at SQS asked me exactly the same thing. Is there a standard? So Evans talks a little bit about UML, and you could start doing your stuff in UML. But have you ever had a business person look at UML and actually understand what on earth they're trying to do? So we don't try and force a standard on there. If people could understand the diagram that we're trying to say, this is one to many, and you can see I actually had words on there. This thing creates this thing does this. I really just try and use nouns and verbs and connectedness inside the system to be able to get some kind of a domain diagram. And sometimes it's a little photograph, sometimes it's a whiteboard picture. I don't have a standard for it, no. And particularly didn't want to subscribe to standard, because along with standards comes the standards police. And I don't like being hit by the standards police. I've been hit by the standards police on Agile, on domain-driven design, on distributed design. And the thing is that as soon as you try and standardize things, it just becomes very, very difficult to think laterally and think out of the box and try and get it working. So no, I don't have a standard. Yeah. Chocolate, beer. No more questions. Okay, I'm going to take Henry and then I'm going to take Brendan.
With that domain diagram that you try to sort of, how do you define the business rules? Do you also include the one diagram? There's something separate that's not part of that diagram when you define?
I think it depends on the relevance of the business rule to what you're trying to do. So generally they're separate. In some sort of way that the business rules could make sense. And sometimes it's just a formula on a piece of paper. Sometimes it's a bit of verbiage inside my glossary of terms. Sometimes it's a sticky note. You can't see them there, but with that Gliffy program that we use, we just have a little sticky note to say, please note that these things should be there. Often I don't put business rules at the top level. I would have brought them down to an aggregate level. Said, okay, this aggregate needs these things, very, very quickly, and lightweight. Everything for me is lightweight, as point form as I can get it to communicate across very easily, but still be able to digest, and more importantly, be able to maintain. Because that's the biggest problem with documentation, is how on earth do you maintain it? It becomes a nightmare, especially that user requirements doc. Last project I worked on, got the user requirements doc, absorbed it all, came into the meeting going, I know what I'm doing here. Started talking to them about this particular thing that they were doing, and they all looked at me like I was on drugs. I said to them, but this is in your specification. Oh, no, we've long abandoned that. But that was prerequisite reading for the meeting. And so you can't, 100 and 200 page documents, I don't believe that they should be there, but I do believe in some form of documentation. Yeah? Do you want to add something, Gene?
I believe is the naming diagrams, not something you should strive for the documentation there. They also to outline reference text, but the most important part of naming is about behavior. If you want to get the naming right into organization, get the naming into organization, describe things differently. Aggregates is describing the rules, what happens when you do something. DDD is about what happens when you do something, not about data after what happens. Describe what happens, those are your rules. That's how you get into an organization, doesn't know about
talk to behavior to anybody, to an analyst, to a business person. Diagrams are just there to show you where things fit. And another comment is the ubiquitous language. It's only ubiquitous in a particular kind of context.
Yes.
Different areas of business don't talk the same language. You can't force them to talk the same way from the whole company. Each kind of concept has its own language. It's only for one part. The rules apply to that one part. They don't apply to everywhere. Well, so we spoke about running rules and saving, things like that. That's the most kind of I've ever had. Was coupling my aggregates to my data. Don't run rules for me on saving. You run rules on performing some operation. How specific is the result at the end of the operation? Doesn't matter. But everything down for us was the biggest thing to getting such a to work in a company. It's easy to describe what you're doing, or tools are when it happens. Not diagram themselves.
Do you use a diagram to confirm the understanding of the requirement? With the domain expert,
it's not necessarily a diagram. I mean, it could be a diagram.
I found it's most useful if it's in the right place. So when you're starting, write everything down and you put the ball into the right bubbles essentially. And that becomes a bounded context for the domain. Each bubble on the diagram is a bounded context essentially, an area where a set of operations fit together. And you use it just to find out where they fit. Once you found where they fit, you often go back to a diagram. Talking about the data.
Diagram's important for new people coming on.
Yeah.
It's important for business stakeholders who forget what you are trying to achieve. But as Eugene says, it serves a purpose to a particular point. All right. Ed? Ed gave us some interesting feedback. He's worked many years in domain-driven design, and it's part of where I'm doing some of my learning and some of the stuff that we argue about. So we're going to go back and have a chat about verification and validation after this. Brendan, you had a question.
Well, my question is more around the development of ubiquitous language now. It's not the easiest thing to do.
No.
We've recently had an experience where there was no domain expert. We had to bump our way through it. And I'm just wondering, what tools do you utilize? Or what tools is the software tools to use from like stickers on a wall to software package? We have one to try and grow ubiquitous language. I mean, because we had a situation where we were going along fumbling, we weren't quite sure what we were doing. And eventually we had this one concept that was open for 3 days, and eventually we had a half day but this is not working. Eventually what came out was the beginnings of our ubiquitous language for that project. And I really feel we've done it more efficiently. Well, I mean, not efficiently, but I don't know, there must have been a better process than that. Are there any tools you use?
No. How do you do it when you don't have an expert to guide you? I mean, it's exceptionally difficult. In some cases, I actually became the expert by, as I said, like, I don't know what the frack farming is all about. But you know what? There's a journal or a guide or something that's going to help me, and that would land on my desk every week. And so very quickly I started to understand what a 1 hectare budget was, and how it worked and how it affected certain things. And it's actually quite, I mean, you can often now I sit next to a farmer at a wedding or something like that, and I can have, frick, I could be there the whole day. I swear I actually had my own crops running out and like things. But that, for me, that's really the only way that I've been able to do it effectively. Now I'm at a disadvantage because you had to solve something very quickly, and I got almost 2 years to start solving a particular problem. But somebody's got a comment, so do you...
In terms of that context, you said that becoming the expert. I've been in a situation where you think you find an expert, go out, you're looking to develop a product, and I've developed a product.
Yes.
I go out and find an expert who happens to have one, it's a broad, say, industry. I did some security software.
Yes.
So I spoke with a security expert, and he was in charge of presidential security. He knew everything in that area. So I based a lot of it around his knowledge, and I sat and spent a lot of time with him. Then you go out and market this thing, and then you find out that's his perspective.
Yeah.
In the broad market, you then find you can't over-promise. So what you actually have to go out is set yourself up and find various experts.
For sure.
Because an expert has a very narrow view.
Based on his experience.
And then you've got to go and make yourself a broader expert.
Exactly. I think that's when you're doing products. I mean, often when we're working on enterprise-based solutions, you've got the experts at hand. You know, they're working inside your organization, they meet your clients, or they meet the organization's clients. That's a particular case, but yeah, you do need to start looking around. I don't know how to solve that problem really easily. The way that we would normally have done it was to start maybe looking at some of the models and analysis patterns, or start pulling out some of the data object models for certain things and going, how have people done it previously, and started to try to get a little bit of a general model and to guide us. But that often pegs your thinking in a particular way, so it often also doesn't solve a particular problem. Your idea of stickies and starting to get that language in is powerful, because the stickies on the board around the project room are very powerful, because that becomes, I see that language, I see that language, I see that language, I see that language. And that's the whole point, is to try and get that language to stick.
That's eventually what we did. I was just wondering if you had any
I think that's one of the ways that we would have done it.
We found, just for sake, that we started doing that too late. Out of frustration, we eventually just full the whiteboard full of stuff and group stickies, and eventually we came up, oh, this is this thing. Yeah. And then we were talking in circles lots, and eventually that's why just mentioned. We both read the book. We both did. We both just understood shooting ourselves in the foot for half a day.
But that is the thing. I mean, I've just recently reread the book, because of, you know, it's been such a long time, and there's just so many things coming back out of it again. There's one question. Do you have a question or comment?
I was just going to say that you're in a situation where there is no, say you're working on something, then it is up to you to,
for sure.
to just take it up and enforce that you do talk the common language.
Yeah. Chocolate, that's all I've got. Yeah.
In the business environment, so if they have a business person who wants to make it, if they say it isn't,
Yeah.
they just have a great idea by that.
Depending on the level of your tester. Some of the testers are great. Good stuff in, good stuff out. Yeah.
How do you do the principal business at the outset? Because you want great to have it to do the project. I can say why you do that. Because you only demonstrate the value of
For sure, for sure. I think often, you know, I've been lucky enough to have people take a leap of faith with me and carry on working. There are certain concepts that you could start bringing to them. Like, there's this large piece of code, and it's very complicated, and it takes this long to actually debug. But there's this, if we just started to compartmentalize things and break things down and spread things out, it might be easier to test, might be easier to maintain. And business people, I don't think we give them enough credit. They do actually understand the concept of software, of return on investment on software. I mean, it's probably one of those big boardroom topics that come out quite a lot. So the idea of breaking it out and showing them this, if we try to do these things, and sometimes you can do it yourself. I mean, a lot of the times what we used to do, Mike, close your ears, because Mike was my BA on the project, was we would like run under the radar and like do certain little things and figure things out and go, okay, cool. We used to ring fence sprint time and go, okay, we're going to do this type of thing. We won't tell them. They don't know. We'll go here and we were burrowing around, like ferreting and doing all these things. So you can do that. So this is the service, this is the value, this is what we're starting to. It does take a little bit of a leap of faith from somebody, and it takes a bit of initiative from somebody to start getting it. And once you start getting the traction, that's when it's powerful. I also think that sometimes it's quite easy to befriend an expert. Hey, how you doing? Tell me a little bit, tell me a little bit, tell me a little bit, tell me a little bit. And before you know it, you've actually got more of them. So that you can do it, slowly catch the monkey. I don't know if I've answered your question, right? But yeah. Cool. All right, Rory is standing by with the things. Right, so this is for a copy of domain-driven design.
Yep.
Logan Govender. Logan, I hope you enjoy.
Thanks, man.
Thanks very much.
Oh, wow.
Thanks so much for coming.